My name is Victor Shelton. I'm the state agronomist and grazing specialist for Indiana. Today we're going to talk about using the pasture condition score sheet with some added information about using these assessments outside of the normal growing season. We'll also talk about collecting data using the step point method. First of all, what are we going to need to do this? A clipboard is certainly handy, and on it enough step point sheets and pasture condition score sheets for the site that you're doing. It's also a good idea to have a copy of the PCS guide with you and a forage guide if needed. And you're also going to need a shovel. The score sheet should be used on individual fields, ideally scored paddock just before it's grazed. This gives you a better assessment to judge adequate rest and health of the system. The paddock presently being grazed may rate lower than it actually is due to removal of some of the forage. If it is continuously grazed, then you can do it at any time, but know that these systems usually will rate lower unless stocked at fairly low numbers. Don't combine fields into one assessment. Most fields do vary some, especially if they're in a rotated system. A very good, properly stocked and rotated system where residual or stock grazing heights are used to manage it usually rank pretty good. You will want to do an assessment for baseline data and because it's needed for CART. Rating pastures annually will show trends in pasture condition over time. Rating pastures at different times of the year can help with management decisions and possibly animal performance. Identifying resource concerns early in the season can help you make management decisions to improve as the growing season progresses. Unfortunately, sometimes the initial assessment of a pasture has to be done outside the normal growing season. This is often true due to program timelines. Some indicators will be slightly more difficult to assess during winter months. We'll talk about some of those today. Under ideal conditions and for accuracy, the pasture condition score sheet should really be done during the growing season. There are 7 indicators that are used in CART. You will refer back to several of these indicator scores to answer questions in CART. In some cases, more than one indicator is used to address the resource concern. Scores for sub-indicators are also used a few times. First, fill out the top of the score sheet. The pasture ID could be the field or paddock number, or the name or description of the field if there is no number. For example, the creek bottom field. Note the soil type or other information if known. Also note livestock type. Then note the season's precipitation and temperature trend. If you're doing this outside the growing season, then note that in the blank blue box on the right. Before we even start to do any more with the pasture condition score sheet, let's talk about step point. Doing step point data collection first can provide a lot of good data and answers to at least 5 of the different indicators. This may seem like extra work, but it adds accuracy and confidence to each indicator and to the total score. Step point is easy to do and really not that time consuming. It's basically a quick transect, but without strict lines. We have 2 step point sheets available. One's for 100 points and the other is for 50 points. Statistically, the 100 points should give you slightly better data. But if you use the 50 point on a small 2-acre paddock as compared to using a 100 point one on a 20-acre field, the size of the field does make a difference. That is 5 points per acre on the 20-acre field compared to 25 points per acre on the 2-acre field. You honestly probably don't want to use less than 5 points per acre unless the field is very uniform, So if the field is really big, either break it down into smaller units by soils, topography, or management differences. Use the 50.1 for small fields, generally less than 5 acres, ideally under 2.5 acres. Use the 100 point for anything that's bigger. Adjust steps accordingly, add more as needed. If in a really small field, then you may want to collect data every third step. But if in a very large field, then you may want to go at least 10 steps for each point to be able to collect sufficient data that's representative for the size of the field that you're working in. Let's look closer at one of those pastures from the earlier map. This field is 4 acres, so we can use the 50-point sheet for it. Walk in a zigzag pattern across the field until you have enough points. In this case, we'll take only 3 steps for each point, that is. I'll be looking at the point of my left boot. So I'll take off with my left foot, so I'll end on my left foot with my third step. On a 100-point sheet, each point represents 1%. On the 50-point, each is 2%. Let's first take 3 steps and see what is the tip of my boot. 1, 2, 3. Let's see what species of plant is at the tip of my boot. This review is being done in December. Plants have stopped growing and most are either dormant, dying, or terminated from freezing conditions. This particular plant that we landed on is tall fescue. It has other species close around it, but my toe landed on the tall fescue. Mark point 1 as fescue. Now let's take a look at the cover here. Use your foot to move the forage to left or right. Record the cover. Is it residue or litter? Rock or stone? Other cover or bare ground? In this case, it was residue, so a cover is easily done any time of the year. You then note on the sheet if the species is a desirable species or not. A data sheet is available for common species for different types of livestock in your state. In this case, the tall fescue for cattle is considered desirable. Now I'll note the type of forage it is. In this case, it is a cool season grass. Lastly, we need to note live plant cover. The fescue is now dormant, but still alive, so we count it as such. If we had stepped on a tuft of crabgrass, say, which is a warm season annual that died with the first good heavy frost, then that would be dead plant material. Note all the indicator information associated with step point are at the bottom of the step point form in the same order as they are in the abbreviated drop-downs. Use this to reference what to put down on a hard copy on the field. Eventually, both step point and the PCS may be available as apps, so you can do this electronically from the field. We will continue collecting data on each point. So 1, 2, 3, landing again on my left foot, we have this time a legume. Even in the winter months, cool season legumes can often be identified. If you look at these clover plants, the one that the toe of my boot touched was red clover. Red clovers have a fuzz on their leaves and stems, and that's easily noted here. In the close background is some smooth-stemmed, not fuzzy clover. This is a white clover. We would record this as red clover, legume, desirable, and residue on the soil surface as confirmed. Sometimes there's a lot of legume present. The nitrogen in the system can break down residue quicker, and you may find less residue on the soil surface because of it, but not always. Mark the data and go on to the next step. On this point, we land on the site where some hay had been fed last winter. Sometimes desirable perennials are set back or smothered out temporarily for a while. You might gain some nutrients in organic matter, but it's usually with a slight cost, but not always. It depends on how it was done and soil conditions. This sometimes allows for opportunist weeds to pop up. In this case, a wild blackberry is the hit on this point. We would note this as blackberry, undesirable, T/S for tree or shrub or brush. The soil is bare underneath the blackberry, and unfortunately it is a live plant. Do you see the telltale sign of another problem weed? It is the fruit of a Carolina horse nettle. You may also hit a point with no plants or cover. If the field was grazed fairly tight under wet conditions, you're going to see more disturbance, especially if there wasn't much forage growth there to start with. Record this point as bare ground, bare for live plants, none for preference, and none for functional group. Some things will be very hard to identify during the winter, if not impossible. Most perennial forages, especially cool season forages, are pretty easy to recognize though. Warm season perennials and even annuals are sometimes able to be identified if enough critical parts remain. On grasses, look for seed heads, auricles, or even ligules at the leaf collars, if that's still present. This is an Indian grass plant. It is a very late maturing warm season grass, so you may find a few seed heads. Broom sedge, on the other hand, is easily recognized. Legumes and forbs can be very difficult to identify during the winter months, especially if all the leaves are gone. This picture is what's left of Desmodium, or better known as beggar's ticks, or its common name of showy tick trefoil. It would be very hard to ID if you're not familiar with the field. It is much easier to recognize during the growing season. You might recognize the sticky seeds from it though. This picture is actually some fairly mature red clover in February. Again, depending on the weather and conditions, things may be harder to identify as winter progresses. Perennials are certainly easier to identify than annuals during the winter. The location of where the assessment is being conducted, the extended time passed since the killing freeze, the present weather conditions, and certainly the presence of snow and ice will impact not only your ability to be able to identify the species, but also the ability to perform the task in some conditions. Mark dead annuals as such if they can't be identified. Mark as dead annual or dead forb, and also the functional group. The animal preference should be noted as if it was during the growing season, unless you're assessing the field for winter grazing use. So if that particular plant would have a desirable preference during the summertime, then mark it so when you do the assessment in the wintertime. Once you have collected all your points, you can enter it into the electronic version like shown and get automated totals, or you can count and figure everything by hand. You see, you now have the information needed for percent desirable species. In this case, it's 90%. And since the desirable species is over 80%, we're going to call this 5 points. It also notes the percentage of legumes, which in this case is 44%. The dominant legumes were red and white clover, which are both potential bloating legumes. So because it's over 40%, it's rated lower because bloating legumes were higher than recommended. Just as a refresher, here's a list of common legumes, noting if they may have potential to cause bloat or not. You should be familiar with most of these. If you don't use step point, you will need to visually estimate the percentage of legumes in the stand. Generally, most soft leaf legumes, visually seen, will be about half that by dry weight. Visual estimates are harder to do and usually less accurate, especially outside of the growing season. You also get the percentage of live plant cover, and it is also 90%. 90% falls within the 4-point category, so mark as such. This indicator usually is really looking at how good the solar energy panel really is. Outside of the growing season, it may not look as alive, but perennials are just dormant and living pretty much off that stored energy. Separating out dormant from dead plant material is a bit more challenging during the winter months. Fields with lots of annuals, especially weedy annuals, will rate lower this time of year, and those plants will generally appear more decomposed or shriveled. And bare soil is often easier to see. We have two functional groups that are 15% or more. So you can now rate diversity once you see how many individual species, desirable species, are also 15% or more. In this case, we have 4: tall fescue, orchard grass, red clover, and white clover. So because we have 4 dominant desirable species present and 2 functional groups, legumes and cool season grasses, we give this indicator a 4. As a quick refresher, desirable species must make up at least 15% of the stand to be considered dominant species, and functional groups must make up at least 15% to be counted as a group. If for some reason desirable species are less than 50% of the stand, then it is automatically discounted to a 1. A functional group can also be represented by minor desirable species that still total at least 15%. The combination of, say, 12% forage chicory and 5% forage plantain would be together more than 15%, and the non-leguminous Forbes functional group would be counted. Residue or litter as soil cover is also provided, and is 98% on this particular pasture. So we will rate it a 5 since it is over 80%. If you did not do step point, then carefully look at the soil surface by pulling back on the canopy and looking to see what is there. Is there a nice duff layer on the soil surface? Or is it bare soil or very heavy and dense with undecomposed plant material? Usually when this is the case, there's more than 1 year's worth of material present. During the step point we found that we had good residue on the soil surface and only one spot where soil was showing. At that spot, there's also no plant growing. So we reduced the percent live plants also. The pasture had very good plant residue or litter as soil cover, and therefore was rated a 5 because it was 98%. Remember, residue is generally decomposing surface plant material and detached. Litter is generally the uppermost layer of detached residue on the soil surface, including freshly fallen or slightly decomposed plant material. Excessive amounts of residue is often an indicator of poor biological activity and or not enough nitrogen in the system. These fields may appear more like an old CRP field, and if this is the case, it should be placed in the lower category as a 1. So after collecting all the data with step point, we have good data to answer 5 of the indicators. This is also very good information to be able to go back to in a few years to see if the species are shifting, especially due to management changes. If we have used step point, we have now finished half of our indicators. We can now continue and finish the last 5. This indicator is a little easier to score during the growing season, but I think it's important to keep in mind that appropriate forage residual heights, or what I would call stop grazing heights, ideally should be maintained year-round. Is it overgrazed throughout? If this has been a long-term or season-long issue, there's often more weeds present and undesirable species present. In these pictures, as we walk around the pasture, close up we don't notice a lot of overgrazing, at least it's minimal. The stand is a bit uneven with some areas closer grazed than others, and there's some close grazing near the watering facility. I would rank this at a 3 because of the uneven grazing. If it has been grazed post-dormancy and grazed harder than normal intentionally to reduce competition of the grass species to establish legumes in the stand by frost eating over winter, then assess it as you would think the field would normally be during the growing season. This also kind of represents the beginnings of some zone grazing, which we'll talk about more in a second. The two extremes should really stand out. We have in the left picture and rated at a 1, severe overgrazing. In the right picture and rated at a 5, an abundant amount of forage, which is certainly not limiting bite size at all. When it's overgrazed, taller species such as orchard grass and even tall fescue sometimes may be reduced and replaced with species that are more tolerant of continuous close grazing, such as bluegrass or white clover. I couldn't find a good picture of zone grazing, so we'll just have to talk this through. I see this the most with extremely long pastures, something like the one in the picture, with walking distances normally over 1,500 feet and water on just one end. The longer the walking distance, the more likely you will find zone grazing. Areas closest to the watering facility would be the shortest forages, and if the walking distance is long enough, the area farthest away from the watering site may not be grazed much at all. We are most interested in the heavier used areas close to that facility due to increased resource concerns. But having forages not utilized well on the very backside is also a concern. If the watering system is also located with the only shade, then the differences will stand out even more. We then need to look at the rest of the pasture. Is most of it being grazed evenly, or is it very uneven outside of that small overgrazed zone area? So if there's zone grazing and you have uneven grazing, but no overgrazing, then you can rate it a 3. But if there is zone grazing and the pasture is evenly grazed and no overgrazing, then you can rate it a 4. Now note that if there is some overgrazing, especially throughout the field, then you're going to rate it a 2 or less. We now need to assess livestock concentration areas. Livestock concentration areas include, but are not limited to, winter feeding areas, and quite often water and mineral or loafing areas, especially when they're combined. There's a high potential for water quality concerns from these areas. The distance it is to surface water and the actual size of the concentrated area is most important. This is a pretty easy example, but in this 4-acre field, there is a livestock concentration area where the mineral feeder and water tank sat during the last grazing event, which happened to also be during a rainy time frame. If you pace this off, it is approximately 50 by 30 feet, or about 1,500 square feet. So it's really pretty small. 1,500 feet is certainly less than 1/10 of an acre. There is no surface water in or near this field, so the distance to surface water is over 100 feet, and the concentration area is less than 1/10 of an acre. Since we are over 100 feet from any surface water, but there is some concentrated area, but it's under 1/10 of an acre, we would therefore mark this indicator a 4. If there was no concentrated areas at all, then it would have been a 5. For a quick review, because this indicator is important, let's go through the point differences again. In the first field, the concentrated area is over 0.1 acres, over 1/10 of an acre, and it is less than 100 feet from the water body, so it's going to be rated a 1. In the second, it is less than 1/10 of an acre, but it is still less than 100 feet from the water body, so it's going to be rated a 2. In the last example, it is greater than 1/10 of an acre, but is over 100 feet from the water body, so the distance is helping mitigate potential issues, so it's going to be rated a 3. The first example here has a concentrated area of less than 1/10 of an acre, and it's also over 100 feet from the water body, so it's low risk and rated a 4, just like our example field. In the next example, there are no concentrated areas, so it's going to be rated a 5. The last example is a field with less than an acre. We will use the percentage of 10% instead of 1/10 of an acre for fields that are under an acre in size. Take the disturbed area and divide it by the field acreage. In this case, it is less than 10% at 7.5%, but it's also under 100 feet to the stream, so we're going to rate it a 2. We now need to check for soil compaction and soil regenerative features. 2 holes should be dug. The first one in a fence line where no compaction is or should be evident. The other hole should be dug inside the pasture, ideally on the same soil type. You want to compare the ease of getting that shovel into the ground to start with. Then note rooting depth, root direction, and also note soil structure. It should be looking more like cottage cheese, indicating a healthy aggregates, and not have platiness, especially in the top 12 inches. And then also observe any earthworm or insect presence or activity. This indicator shouldn't be too terribly different than during the growing season, except you may not be able to see as much soil life, or at least it may not be as active. If you're experiencing frozen conditions, first try and dig where there is more cover, which is more insulated. The heavier the sod, the more likely you may be able to dig down. If you cannot dig the holes due to the ground being frozen, then at last resort, refer again to all the previous indicators that are somewhat pre-indicators of this indicator. There is a reason that the indicators are in the order that they are in. Rate each sub-indicator, that is compaction, roots, color, and soil life, individually. Then choose the most adverse factor for the deciding score based on the two primary sub-indicators, which is compaction and roots. Soil color and soil life shouldn't be deciding factors, but used for discussion for soil health as indicators where improvements could be beneficial. On this site that we're on, there is just slightly a platy layer about 2 inches down, with the rest of the profile containing very good aggregates. It is honestly on the borderline between a 4 and a 5. I'll lean towards the conservative side because there is that slight compaction layer, even though probably it's not a major issue, and give it a 4. The roots indicate the same thing, slightly more horizontal roots at that thin platy layer, but there are more roots that are generally moving downward with no effort. I would place that in the 4 category also. You'll see that these two, compaction and roots, are often very similar for good reason. The topsoil is significantly darker than the subsoil, but the subsoil also has a fair amount of organic matter slightly deeper than normal. It is okay for it to not be too contrasting if the subsoil is gaining organic matter and getting darker. What you don't want to see is the topsoil too similar to the subsoil in both light and color. It may be early December, but there's still a lot of earthworm activity going on and even a few random beetles and grubs. It is very evident that the soil is very active during the growing season. We'll rate this factor a 5. The fence line hoe in this case was very similar to the hoe dug in the field. In simplest terms, plant vigor refers to the health of the plant. The more severe the grazing, especially when you're not maintaining stock grazing heights, the longer the recovery is going to be. Most severe grazing occurs when the pasture is overstocked. Pasture plants, when continuously grazed, have little or no recovery. As far as color, pale green grass plants can indicate low fertility, or cool, wet, and poor soils, or just poor growing conditions. Nitrogen-starved grasses will be obvious and contrasting. Dark green spots under dung or urine patches make it even more obvious. In the wintertime, this indicator will normally be very difficult to assess. Forages are often pale, green, or brown in the dormant state. If the rest of the previous scores were good, then this indicator should be likewise because it is somewhat reflective of the previous indicators. If they were not so good, then rate it appropriately. I would rank this a 4 based on the previous indicators and because the site is still a good, healthy green. You wouldn't think that you could have sheet and row erosion in a pasture, but you certainly can. It's usually tied to cover and disturbance. If you have heavy rainfall events after a major grazing event, especially under wet conditions, soil can move. That's a good incentive to always maintain good cover. If you walk a pasture during a rain, Especially during a big rain, you'll see exactly where the water is flowing and its impact. Where water concentrates, you have more potential for erosion. If these concentration areas were in a crop field, you would probably encounter ephemeral gullies. We don't use that term normally for pastures, but you can start to see reels, and those reels eventually turn into gullies, especially if you have sudden elevation changes. If you look at this same field in the picture on a LiDAR map, the possible problem areas show up quickly. At the end of this valley is a small stream with about a 6-foot drop in elevation. The combination of abrupt changes in elevations and concentrated water flow is the beginning, normally, of a major classic gully. Under these circumstances, good vegetation management will slow the damage down, but eventually it's got to be fixed. On this field, there is some sheet and reel erosion, mainly because of moderate runoff from slightly less forage density, and there is the start of some gully erosion. Remember, the most adverse type of erosion indicates the score, and since the gully erosion was rated a 2 and it is the lowest, the overall score for erosion is going to be a 2. So now add up the scores. We got a 37. That's pretty good. The overall score gives us an idea of suggested management changes. You can see that in the table from the score that you got. A pasture rated with a high score is well managed, with plant and animal productivity being sustained or even enhanced. A low rating typically means the pasture has one or more challenges. Even though this pasture received a decent score, it still has some resource concerns that need to be addressed, such as gully erosion, too many potential bloat-causing legumes, perhaps slightly better grazing management to try and achieve a little bit more even grazing. In conclusion, remember, pastures should be rated at least annually. Rating pastures on a regular basis can help us track trends on pasture condition. Review the score sheet with the landowner if possible, especially indicators that scored low, to see where improvements could be made. And remember, the pasture condition score sheet is needed to answer some questions in CART. This concludes this presentation on using the pasture condition score sheet, with some emphasis on using it outside the normal growing season. If you have any questions, please contact your area or state grazing specialist.